Hello, welcome. My name is Steve Schweiger. I'm here to teach effort-based scheduling. Give me a moment here when we get started. So, effort-based scheduling is kind of a dying practice, but it is important to understand how the scheduling tools, particularly tools like Microsoft Project and Open Workbench, which I will use as a demonstration, how the underlying mechanics of the tools work. And effort-based scheduling is the concept upon which they were built. And I hope to demonstrate that today. The other thing that I would like for you to get out of this, even though you may not support effort-based scheduling in a work environment, if you understand the underlying concepts, you'll be able to apply some of the concepts to the things that you have to do within the environment in which you're in. Now, my background is I have been with a Fortune 100 company for the past 15 years. I've since retired and been on myriad PMOs. Prior to that, I was what was called a project officer for a medium-sized consulting firm where we examined how the projects were performing against metrics, and essentially it was a form of earned value management. And it's really difficult to get to earned value management without doing some form of effort-based scheduling. So I'll do a brief demo on the impact of effort-based scheduling. We'll talk about the advantages of it, and we'll talk about some of the challenges associated with it. Let's go ahead and dive in. So quite frankly, the purpose of today's training, in addition to what I just said, is to defeat yesterday's understanding. So I'm hoping that what you'll get from this is an idea of how the scheduling engines work. Our objectives here will be to introduce you to the concept of effort-based scheduling. They're tool agnostic. I'm going to probably lean heavily on Open Workbench. And a little bit of a caveat here, I am not anti-Microsoft. In fact, Microsoft Project is actually a very good tool. What I find in terms of trying to do effort-based scheduling, though, either through my ignorance or lack of understanding, or in fact limitations in the tool, it's a challenge to do what I can see Open Workbench doing. I actually have reached out to a Microsoft expert and am waiting to get back information on how to particularly do this. When I find out, I will update on the site how to go about doing it, but I will attempt to demonstrate it and talk to you about the gotchas. The intent is not to teach these tools per se, though we will do a brief demo and you can see what these tools can do to a degree on this space. So we will do a demonstration. I'm going to definitely do Open Workbench, and then we'll do a brief setup on Microsoft Project. So what's the definition? The definition of effort-based scheduling is to derive schedules based on resource assignment and resource availability. If you look at the underlying calculations that these tools use, and this may be old hat for many of you, but it's always good to kind of revisit it. Within Open Workbench, duration is a function of the estimate to complete divided by resource availability. Within Microsoft Project, it's very, very similar conceptually. Duration is work divided by units. I'll get into this a little bit later, but work in this concept does not estimate to complete. Work within the construct of Microsoft is remaining work, which would be the equivalent of estimate to complete plus actual work. So it looks at the whole breadth, and then units are what you see if you're familiar with Microsoft Project, is that particular resource, what they're available to that particular task at that time. One note, and I'll reiterate this, is Microsoft allows you to enter time or effort at the task level. And then as you add resources, it decrements that time. Open Workbench does not. Open Workbench requires an assignment level, and you'll find that that's extremely important whenever you're trying to do effort-based scheduling. So why do it? and I've kind of alluded to it, is it is a resource-centric approach as opposed to a task-centric approach. Microsoft allows for both. Open Workbench pretty much does not, because everything's driven at the assignment level. So the task centricity that you have in Microsoft Project gets you to a schedule quickly. The question is it rooted in reality from the standpoint of the amount of work that needs to get done? And that's really the question we're trying to answer. And so we will talk about and caution you on, here's how you should approach your schedule if you want it to be meaningful, because that is really the idea, is to provide a dynamic modeling control rather than static reporting. If you're only looking for static reporting, I would use Microsoft Project hands down, okay? Because essentially what you're doing is you're manually creating a schedule so you can present to somebody so that you can pass some sort of phase gate. The challenge becomes, if you have somebody that challenges your schedule, do you have the underlying data that can support essentially the durations within that? And then furthermore, the schedule then is firmly grounded in the work rather than, if you will, arbitrary deadlines set by somebody who wants a particular product or service or deliverable by a certain time, but has limited reference point as to what it's going to take to get there and to deliver that particular product. So what are the benefits? To the project or the organization you're with, you get visibility into demand curves. Now you understand what's being demanded of the organization, particularly for your project, applied against the resource availability, and it then gives you real-time updates so that you can have credible capacity planning. You know, if a resource is being consumed and they're not available, and this really Open Workbench was the forerunner. It used to be called ABT Workbench, to what became NICU, and what you would know as Clarity is now CAPPM, and it was taken over by CA, and then Broadcom. When you marry that with a tool like that, you can see then the resource capacity across multiple projects. And there is a tie-in to Microsoft Project as well. Again, we'll go over briefly why Microsoft isn't quite as sensitive to resource availability as, say, an Open Workbench. Therefore, the theory would be that I can increase my ability to keep promises to customers, or a better way to say that I can manage the customer's expectations because I know what I have and what's committed to me, and I can do fact-based capital allocation management and resource distribution, right? I now have data which I can show and say, look, I need this in order to get that done. The project management, the schedules are achievable, or a better way to say it is I now can set better expectations because I know what my constraints really are. They're measurable. I can audit them so that my forecasts have value. And I have visibility into what's planned, what's actual, and I can increase the quality of my fact-based decisions, particularly as it relates to the schedule and the cost risks. So in part of my role, my job was to press the project managers on where they were. And I was having one particular project manager being extremely argumentative. And I basically said, look, it's 4 simple questions. What's your plan? Or what you should be asking is, what's my plan? And what we mean by plan is, if you think of the project management plan as a combination of, essentially a statement of work with a supporting schedule and arguably a risk register, baselined, what are my schedules so that I know what my quality parameters are, my schedule, and my budget, or scope, schedule, budget. Then as my project evolves, what are my approved changes? Because once you have an original plan and then you have changes that are approved, both of those become your current scope, your current approved scope, or your baseline. Then you can then measure and say, how am I doing against my plan, my approved baseline in particular, and my product and deliverable acceptances, right? If I'm not getting deliverable acceptances, or there isn't a mechanism for that, how do I know that I'm done? Okay. And then you can do the EAC, the estimate to complete, or the forecast, and say, what do I have left to do? So the whole idea of effort-based scheduling is to be able to answer these 4 questions. And these 4 questions emanated from a frustrated project auditor who basically said, these are the 4 questions I want answers to. And by the way, that project manager could not answer them in a metric-based format. It was all what they felt. And what I was trying to get to is your project plan, and when I use a plan, I don't mean schedule, I mean your PMP, your schedule, your risk register, is your plan measurable such that we can feel confident that you can execute against that? So ETC drives status. It's the basis for the 4 questions. So getting to my description, here's my project management plan. And within that, I have my deliverable, I have my hours, and the costs associated with those hours. Now, I can put those in a project management plan, but are they supported by a credible schedule? And my argument would be is I don't know how you can do a PMP without having a supporting schedule. So you can see that the section of the PMP that talks about the deliverables and the costs and what you're going to deliver should be supported by the schedule. And by the way, you should be able to extract the numbers directly out of your project schedule. This snapshot happens to be from Open Workbench. I could just have easily done this from Microsoft Project. And I can then drive that into my project management plan. So I do a schedule based on what I know. It's not the full project, it's what I know today. There may be some open-ended ones, but that's why I have change requests to update it. Or I write a new PMP when I get more information. And then the other point here is commitments are made to estimates to complete. Not to the deliverables, to the ETCs. And the ETCs then are traceable to the deliverables, okay? So there may be more detail underneath each of those deliverables, and in fact, the little plus sign here implies that there is more detail, but the roll-up at the deliverable level is really what you're looking for in your schedule. Additionally, now moving forward, now that you've got a project schedule set up this way, as you begin to record actuals against the schedule and updated ETCs from your resources, you now can begin to drive, if you wanted to, which is implied in the status report, you can drive your schedule performance index, your SPI, earned value management right out of the PMBOK, or your CPI, your cost performance index. And it makes your status reporting much more concise, because what you can do, you can say deliverable 1 looks great, its SPI is 1.04, its CPI is 0.95, we're good. Same with deliverable 2, and then I get my overall. Now there's a lot of documentation, and earned value management is very, very hard to implement. I understand. It's the basis, though, conceptually for this content. So you can understand the things needed to do that. If you're ever wondering why nobody does it, you can see why there's a certain amount of administrative overhead. But the underlying concepts are to do this and to do it well. You drive your deliverables via ETCs, via a series of tasks that have ETCs so that you can cost them. And now your status report is nothing more than a dump out of your project schedule and your earned value management metrics. And as it says in 4, your status is measured against your performance baseline. You baseline your whole schedule, you're executing it. And if these things are drifting, once these things begin to get below 0.9, you're not going to recover. Just, you know, when you multiply these two together, if they're less than 0.9, your odds without a change request of hitting the original understanding within your PMP and your defining documents is going to be a challenge. So what are the outcomes? Why do this thing? It protects the project team because there's a very good understanding of what is being committed to. It's been baselined. Hopefully it's driving realistic estimates with facts rather than unsupported mandates. There's a whole different section on estimating and how we go about estimating. There's no easy answer to it, but you know, you're lining up your estimates, and those estimates are agreed upon. They may be flawed, but that's then where you have your allowance for variance, right? Or what would be your contingency. Either your estimates are off. A lot of times in estimates, you're just outright missing deliverables. And if you're familiar with the cone of uncertainty, if you look up the word COCOMO, C-O-C-O-M-O model, there's a lot of discussion on it. If you're at the concept stages of the project, you can be off on your estimates by as much as 300%. So recognize where you are and only map out a PMP and a project schedule for what you do know. And that's kind of what we would call rolling wave scheduling. It communicates cost and schedule concisely for what you know, facilitates status reporting because it just falls right out of your project schedule. And if you have management that truly understands this stuff, it's really fantastic because now you can just say, here's my SPI, my CPI for the overall project, and for each of my deliverables, here's the one deliverables in trouble, here's what I'm trying to do with it. Boom, you're done. It demonstrates an understanding of the work and the sequencing. So it gives the organization a high level comfort that you as the project manager do have your arms around it. And it provides a solid foundation for controlled change. Now, when you come and ask me for a change request, we can have a conversation about those pieces that are lagging and understand why they're lagging. Was it poor estimating? Was it lack of skill on the particular resources, which have led to the poor estimating? Was it lack of understanding of the scope of what that needed to be? We can have all those conversations. And quite frankly, one of the conversations is, do we continue to fund this particular project? Do we think this thing's going to grow? So it gives a really solid foundation for conversation. So effort-based scheduling example. I'm going to go an example here, then I'm going to demo the example, and then I'll let you go forward from there with it, and I will follow that up with more information on further utilizing the tools, but it's going to be a brief demo. But let's do a paper example, and then we'll actually duplicate that in the two tools. So as I mentioned earlier, duration is a function of estimate to complete divided by the daily resource availability. So in this example, I have a task 1. It's got 2 resources. It's got Fred. He's got ETCs and daily availability of 6.4 hours a day. And then you have Barney, who is ETCs, 30 hours and daily availability of 2 hours a day, or 25%. So the total tasks ETCs are 110. And notice my ETCs are at the assignment level, not at the task level. The roll up the assignments is 110 hours. What's the duration of this task? Well, if you were to take this and just do a little bit of math, I'm going to try to do it here so you can see it. If I take 80 hours and divide it by 6.4, which is Fred's constraints, you'll see that we're looking at 12 and a half days. You can probably do the math in your head. If you look at Barney, he's got 30 hours, but he's only available 2 hours a day to work on my project or my task in this particular case. So if I divide that by 30, you'll see that that's actually 15 days. So in fact, even though Fred has more ETCs, Barney is the constrained resource, and so the resource constraint is driving the length of the task. This is where we get to the concept of resource centricity, is the task duration is driven by the availability of the resource and what they have to do on the task. Not the task takes me 15 days or 12 days, no, or the task takes me 110 hours, no. It's which resources are working on it and how much time do they have on that particular task. So, I just gave you that particular answer. It's 3 weeks or 120 hours or 15 days of duration because it's 30 hours divided by 2 hours of daily availability. So let's extend the example a little bit. Now I've got task 2 in the same project schedule. Fred again has 64 hours instead of 80 on the last one. Pebbles is another resource. Pebbles is there 40 hours and she's got 4 hours of availability or 50%. 6.4 hours is 80%. So we got total ETCs for the task of 104. What's the task duration? So take a minute and think about it. And if we do the straight math, of course, if you look at it, I did it. If I get 6.4 hours a day and I got 64 hours, that's 10 days. And if I have 40 hours divided by 4, that's 10 days. So that task should take 10 days, correct? The answer is actually 23 days. And you go, whoa, wait a second, why? The math doesn't work. Well, this then gets back to the resource constraint. Remember, Fred was on the other task. He's already executing on that task. This particular task is going to take 23 days because Pebbles is not constrained, so she can do her portion of the task. Fred's got to wait to finish the other task, working under the assumption that the other task has a higher priority than task 2. So as this says here, Nancy starts on day 1, the same time as task 1, but Fred is already committed. So if weekends are included, he's not available until day 17. And then we've got essentially 10 days. So Fred's constraint would never be visible if we keyed in dates or fixed durations unless an artificial dependency was placed there. That is, I could have made task 2 of higher priority either with a dependency or using the workbench, the priority capability. If there's a dependency between task 1 and 2, I already answered this question, then what's the duration of the project? And the answer there is, it depends. And you say on what? Which task is the predecessor, the type of relationship? Are we driving any lag? Does there have to be some lag in there? So there are myriad things to think about. But again, the basis is I'm doing ETCs in Microsoft Project Parlance remaining work at the assignment level, not at the task level. So what would that look like? So this is a screenshot from Open Workbench. The red there that you see that's the critical path task whenever you do the auto scheduling or the run the scheduling engine. And you can see I have Fred at 80 and Barney at 30, like in the example, starting on the 10th of February, Monday. And you can see that we run Fred out until the 26th. And then notice Fred then starts on task 2 for 3.2 hours to match his 6.4 availability. This is what this is down here. This will say availability. If I set this thing up correctly, this is the resource availability in Open Workbench. I'll demo that. But you can see Pebbles has already done her work on task 2 because she's available. And then the remaining amount of work that Fred needs to do on this pushes this out to the 11th. And therefore, we've got 23 days of duration, 15 days of duration here. So the duration of the total project is 23 days. Again, that's driven by these ETCs of 80 for Fred, 30 for Barney, 64 for Fred on this task, and 40 for Pebbles, and their individual availability. So let's go over the demonstration. Again, I want to reiterate the calcs. Can't drive these home enough. These are how these tools fundamentally work. If you understand these, you can understand the action. And I want to spend a little time on Microsoft Project, just so that if you're using MSP, you understand how that works. So two calcs. One, work in MSP, which used to be called total work, is the addition of the remaining work, what Open Workbench would call ETCs, estimate to complete, plus any actuals that have occurred. Open Workbench equivalent of work is called total usage, and it is the summation of the estimate to complete plus actual usage or actual work. Usage and work are synonymous in this context. So that's good to know. Now, look at the calculation. If you're very familiar with Microsoft Project, you'll know that you can set, I believe it's the task type, I should know this, my apologies. You can set it to default to fixed duration, fixed units, or fixed work. It's an algebraic equation. So out of the box, fixed units is in fact the default, and I agree with that default. That can be set at the task level, or excuse me, the assignment level within a task for each resource. That can get cumbersome. You can certainly do that, but you can also set for a resource the maximum availability, and it will apply that maximum availability, and we'll demonstrate on how you do that. Then you can put the ETCs on, and then if you've got AutoCalc on, it will drive a duration for that particular task. Similarly with Open Workbench, but before I go, notice though, it's looking at the overall work. So it takes into consideration the actuals that have occurred, because notice that's work, not remaining work, and the remaining work, and develops the schedule, which I find kind of odd. Whereas if you look at the difference with an Open Workbench, okay, two things, I can do resource availability, and this is where when you have Open Workbench connected to Clarity, or even if you have Workbench alone, Workbench allows you to create a variable resource availability. So for the month of April, I could be available 80% of the time. For the month of for the month of March, I could be available 8% of the time. For the month of April, I could be available 50% of the time, and it will be sensitive to my availability and will elongate the task as it drifts into April because I have less availability. And then if I have higher availability the following month, it'll shrink the task based on my availability. Microsoft allows you to put in, and I'll try to show this to you, allows you to put in variable availability as well, but the scheduling engine is not sensitive to it. It just shows an overallocation, and that becomes cumbersome. That is the question that I reached out to this Microsoft expert online. I'm going to see if he is going to get back to me and I can update the notes with what his response was, because I was not able to get this thing to be sensitive to that. Thus my bias towards Open Workbench. I'm not saying Microsoft can't do it. And in fact, Microsoft can do it if the availability doesn't vary much. But that's the challenge that we see. So it's really important to understand these. And then you can begin to see the predictability. One of the things that the recent versions of Microsoft Project come out with is where the default is that tasks are not automatically calculated. My sense on why that occurred is I had heard, at least in the environments I was in, the frustration with Microsoft in terms of it moving the dates and driving the project managers crazy. Well, if you don't have the tool calculating anything for you, yeah, it won't move the dates and you can keep them. And debatably then, that schedule is just for reporting purposes only. It's there to look good and look nice, which Microsoft Project does exceptionally well. But essentially, you're not necessarily driving anything that's rooted in reality, unless the durations that you are arguably fixing by putting start and end dates are rooted in history, and you know those are the durations of what the organization does. And then at that point, effort-based scheduling becomes meaningless, because now you have an analogous estimate that works for you because you have duration estimates as opposed to work estimates that'll work. So let's go into the demo, hopefully, and then we'll go into the challenges. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull in Open Workbench first. So for those of you not familiar with Open Workbench, briefly, it's very stark compared. There is a version that I can't download. I'll get you the version I download here. It is open software that you can download yourself if you have access to download and put things onto your particular desktop. The version that I have here is 1.16. The latest is 2.12. Broadcom, even though it's open, Broadcom has control over the distribution. I have not found a site where you can download 2.12. In a corporate environment, 2.12 is available, and you end up with a ribbon structure, much like you have with Microsoft Project and the Microsoft products in general. And it's a much more user-friendly. But I will tell you that these standard views, which you have on the left, are very stark. And you'll see in this particular instance, it's extremely stark. What you'll find, and I actually created this view for this demo, is this is a dual panel. Up here is task-related information. Down here is resource-related information. So I can do task 1, and notice it'll create a separate line from. Then I can do task 2, and you'll see that it's got a start date of 2/12 because that's today. What I want to do is I want to go to the project properties, and if I look at scheduling, I want the start date to be 2/10. I should have done that first. I'm going to impose that. Well, 2/10, and I'm going to impose the 2/10. I do not know why it's doing that. Click out. You can see opposed to 2/10. So I'm going to impose the start date of 2/10. Let me go back. I want to make sure these start on 2/10, so I'll force the date here. Normally don't like to do this, but and then I can start putting in my resources. So in the example that we had certainly Fred. So we'll key in Fred. I'll key in Barney. And we'll key in Pebbles. And you'll see that in this case, I actually put availability there. And if you recall, this was 6.4 hours. This one was 2 hours, which is 25%. And if you remember, Pebbles was at 4 hours a day. So there's the availability. Now, if you also recall, I assigned Fred and Barney to task 1. And all I did was highlight Fred and Barney, came off of this and slid that up and was able to do it. And then you'll see I'm going to highlight Barney and Pebbles, come off, just click in here, and then I can, whoops, drop this on 2, and now you can see, I'm going to pull this panel over, I've got the assignments. Now I can drive in their ETCs. So the ETCs in the example, I had 80 for, whoops, they got it in reverse for me. So it was 30 for Barney, and I screwed this up. So I'm going to have to fix this. And I did 80 for Fred. And then in this particular thing, under resources, it wasn't Barney that was here. It was actually Fred. I had to double click to get Fred up there. And I want to slide Fred. No, it's not going to let me slide Fred up. Now I can do my estimates here, but I'm going to If I don't do okay, it won't save it. So I have Fred and Pebbles, and in this case, Fred was 64 and Pebbles was 40. Now, you'll note in Open Workbench, there is the auto schedule is not real-time auto schedule, the scheduling magic. So you can see that this is showing that these resources are way over allocated for that particular day. So when I come up here, I come up and do auto schedule. I'm going to do it for 210, and I'm going to do resource constraints. So if I do resource constraints, do okay, you'll see that I now have the spread of the hours for each of the resources. So in this particular instance, you'll see that Fred started here, just like in the example. And then you'll see Fred doesn't start until here, taking us out to the 11th. There's our 23 days of duration, which is calculated by the tool using that formula, right? Duration is a function of work, which is what, ETCs, divided by the resource availability, which are these guys. I can set up a view where I can modify this resource, and I can have this resource availability done week over week, and I can key in the resource availability week over week and modify it. So I can say Fred's available for 6.4 for these 3 weeks, and then 50% those, and that would modify how this would get spread, because this spread is sensitive to the availability. This particular entry assumes that Fred's available for whatever the length of the project is going to be at 6.4 hours. We can get into why 6.4 versus others. My take on that, just briefly, is that if you use 100%, you're not taking into consideration that there might be PTO, there might be team meetings that have nothing to do with executing against the project, town hall meetings, you name it, sickness, whatever, okay? If you plan with 100%, your schedule is going to essentially build in its failure because nobody's available to your project 100%. Very rarely, unless you're working overtime, but that has limitations as well. So that's essentially an effort-based scheduling. Now, I'm not going to demo forward. Maybe for another day we could go into how this would apply to earn value, but essentially what you do is you would then baseline this. We would put dollars. I could put a rate on for each of these resources. So effectively, I could put a rate here. It's got $1, but I could put a rate in here for each resource, and then essentially I could do a version of this in dollars as opposed to hours. I would just flip the cost, and in fact, I could probably do that, though at $1 an hour, it's going to look the same. You've got the ability to take the resource assignments, and I can do this in cost. And then when I do it in cost, you'll see it's reflective of dollars. So it's essentially saying this is $6.40 and $2 because their rates are $1 an hour. If I modify Fred's rate to be 100, now I'm spreading my cost. Now you begin to see where I have my ETCs linked to my cost, and now I can see cost in a real-time factor. You can do this with Microsoft Project as well. It's not limited there. So I want to go ahead and take this back to, I'm hitting F3 to get to this particular menu. I'm going to go back to hours. And by the way, I could duplicate and I could put hours and then put right underneath of it another resource assignment. And then I can turn it into cost, and I can have the hours and costs stacked on top of each other. It gets to be a little busy, but it's certainly doable. So you would baseline this, and then when you baseline it, now you have to start clocking your actuals. And in fact, this tool does have on this, do I want to save it? I want to save the view, replace it, long story there. But I could time phase, which I don't have, so I won't do, but I could put in what the actuals are by week, rerun the schedule, and let me jump back to this. If I put the actuals in, and let's say for Fred, he only booked 5 that day and 3 that day and 4 that, it would push this schedule out and push this one out, because I'm assuming the ETCs don't get modified. I'm working under the assumption that I now need to push out the task because Fred is not putting the amount of time on it that I need him to put on it in order to meet this particular schedule. So ultimately, there needs to be a conversation with Fred and or Fred's manager, assuming I'm not Fred's manager, and say, why isn't Fred putting more time on that? And is he constrained? Now I've got to put in a change request and or manage expectations of management if this is on critical path. That's what effort-based scheduling gives you. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the challenges. Keeping up with the actuals and the ETCs are a challenge. So let's do the similar thing in Microsoft Project. You'll see here that I've already done it, but let me go ahead and do a new schedule and show you what I have to go through in order to do that with Microsoft Project. So if I do File and we do New and just do a blank project. Okay, so now we're at a blank project, and I want to put in 2 tasks. So let me go ahead and put task 1 in, task 2 in. Now, real quick, let me jump here. Remember I said advanced. Yeah, it was task type, right? So this is not highlighted for update because the task mode is manual. If I make these automatic calculation, I need to just be patient here with this and say auto schedule. Now, if we do the information and I go to advanced, you'll see that fixed units, there's my fixed duration, fixed units, fixed work. What I want is to calculate that based on that and that, okay? That's the challenge with Microsoft, is it's supposed to be an algebraic equation where I'm solving for one unknown, and I actually potentially have 2 unknowns if I don't know what I'm doing. And this is where it gets really interesting, is if you default this and you were to go in and hard key in a duration and then put a resource on there, it'll create ETCs for you. So think about that. If I go in and I hard key this, put a resource on there, with it auto scheduling, it's going to create ETCs for me. That may or may not be what you want, okay? Conversely, if I go in and I enter actuals or enter in the amount of work, because I could expose the work column here, put it in, and then as I add resources to it, it will say, oh, I'm assuming that resource is going to consume at their particular rate of availability those hours. Again, that may or may not be what you want. I prefer to enter in the hours at the assignment level. But before I do that, the other thing that we need to do then is I'm going to create the resource sheet. I'm going to be disciplined here, and I'm going to create the resources. So I'm going to say Fred, Barney, Pebbles. And this max represents the max units availability, if you will, that each of these can have. And remember, this one was 80%, that's 6.4 hours. If you remember, Barney was available for 2 hours a day, that's 25%. And if you remember, Pebbles was available for 4 hours a day, that's 50%. So now I've set up my resources, and I would, in discipline, you may want to have some sort of coding here so you can understand what they are. I try to get into the discipline of coming to the resource sheet, putting it in there as opposed to hand keying it in. That, and I try to use last name, comma, first name. That then gives me the discipline that I want, so that whenever I go in and start adding resources, they're already there and I know what their availability is. So then let's jump back to the Gantt chart. And what I like to do here is do view, and I want to see the details. So I've got the details here, and I'm on task 1. So what I want to do is add resources. So I'm going to add a resource. We're going to add Fred, and then we're going to turn around and we're going to add Barney. And if you recall, remember what I said, work is the sum of actual work plus remaining work. So work is the sum of these 2 columns. What we want is we want remaining work for Fred. Well, if you recall, for task 1, it's 80 hours. And for task 2, and I want this to start on the 10th. Now, it may constrain me. No, it didn't constrain me because I don't know if I've said when the project was going to start. I should have done that constraint as well. And now we're going to put in Barney for 30 hours. Boom. Have not run anything on the scheduling. So now let's go. We want to go down to task 2. You move tasks of project 3 to start. This is before the project start date. Continue, move the task to start before the project. Yes, I'm going to say okay. And guess what? It did a calculation for me. Okay, so it's already done the calculation for me because I set auto schedule. And this is going to be tied to the resource constraints as they're set up into the leveling. But we'll get to that in a minute. Similarly, I'm going to set this to auto schedule. And this time we're going to do Barney, and then we're going to do Pebbles. And if you recall, remaining work, and notice, by the way, my brain is jumping around. We got the 80%, which is the max that we'd set in front, and the 25% Barney, which is the 2 hours. Okay? And if you recall, it was 15 days. Well, duration's 15 days, right? So that worked, that checked out, effort-based scheduling. So in this one, Barney had, excuse me, it wasn't Barney, it was Fred. So this is supposed to be Fred as well. And the remaining work for Fred on this was 64 hours, and Pebbles was 40 hours. And we're going to make sure this one starts on 10, because I just want to start it on a Monday. And I'm going to key out, same thing, yes, continue that. And it split this. Now what it did is it's creating the gap here for Fred. And it's actually behaving the way I want it to behave. I was doing this earlier and it wasn't quite behaving the way I want it to behave. But let's stay with it. So the thing that drives this is if we look at the leveling options, notice I have this on automatic. So it's actually using the resource constraints. And I had done this already. That defaults to manual. It defaults to day-to-day. It defaults to level. This one defaults to standard. I cannot tell you what standard does. I tried to look it up, could not understand the behavior. I was hoping to use priority because you can set a priority on each task. It didn't seem to honor the priority. It's one of the questions I have out to the Microsoft expert. But what I did set on was ID only. And by the way, Open Workbench works the same way. What ID only means is based on the internal task ID, in essence, the order in which I've entered it in, those take priority in lieu of either a dependency constraint or a priority constraint. And again, I have not been able to iron out the priority. So now with this setup, I would set this to automatic. I'd set this to ID only, level the entire project. You can see that I now have something that looks similar. And if you really want to take a dive deeper, I'm going to go ahead and not show this split. We'll come over here and I'm going to go over to, let's look at task usage. Well, now you see something that looks very similar to what we had in Open Workbench. If I shrink these up a little bit too much and slide this over, this did 20 days. So I'm trying to figure out what it did here, whereas I believe the Open Workbench was 23 days. I may have keyed the hours in wrong. I'm trying to look, it doesn't look like I did. But it has a similar constraint. So essentially, this was 15 days, very consistent with the Open Workbench one. And you can see that we're getting, notice this says work. And remember, work is remaining work plus actual work. It's the one thing that I get frustrated with this view. I can also show actual work. So the fact that actual work is 0 means that these are, in fact, my ETCs. So these are my ETCs spread across. So I'm going to hide actual work. and we'll assume that that's ETCs. I wish they would show remaining work as well, just so I could see it, but hey, I take what I can get. So when we look at this, we see that we are constrained by Barney, because Barney runs it out to here. And then when we get to Fred down here, Fred does his 3.2 here, and he essentially runs this out here to Wednesday for 20 days. And 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Yeah, roughly. So this one actually pulled it in a couple of days ahead, and I'm going to go back and see where the constraint changed. But essentially, on Wednesday, we get 3.2 from Fred, and then it runs it out to the following Wednesday. So I do not know why this is saying 20 days. This looks like 5, 10, 15, 23. I don't know why that's saying 20 days in duration, because clearly it's 23 days worth of duration. But that's essentially the same pattern that we get with Open Workbench using the task usage view. I can also do resource usage view, which is the task usage view in reverse. So instead of it being task focused, I can see now who is being used by which task. I find these views extremely useful, particularly if you're doing effort-based scheduling, because you can really get a feel for why the task is as long as it is and what's driving that. Now, if we modified their parameters, you would see that. So what I want to do is I want to go back to the the task usage, but before, and use that as a basis. But before I do that, let me go back to the resource sheet. Remember, I said that I could go into the resource and I could say, I can go and put availability here. So let me go from the 10th through, I believe it takes me through the 12th of the 13th. Through the 13th, we'll do 80%. And then what I want to do is, let's do something a little crazy here. Let's go from the 16th to let's go the 1st of May, and let's do this at 50%. So I now have, and you'll see that I now have begun to make the resource availability in Microsoft Project variable. So let me flip back to task usage. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to add another task. I'm going to call this task 3. And in task 3, I'll go do my split screen again, which is view details. And then I'm right mouse buttoning and I'm doing work, which is what I was on. So if I select task 3, I'm going to put Fred on this. And just for grins, we're just 100 hours. And I've got my 100 hours. The start, I'm going to let it calculate the start, and then I'm going to eliminate the split. And notice this isn't automatically scheduled. If I auto schedule this, the project cannot resolve it. Let's just do a skip here. Don't worry about that. Notice what it did is it was smart enough to say, okay, from a priority standpoint, because I set the resource leveling constraints to be ID only, day by day and automatic, it kicked this thing out, which is phenomenal. Okay, but notice it's at 6.4. Well, for the back part of this, I constrained it. So notice the little red here. This task is over allocated. This is my frustration with Microsoft Project. And again, this could be my lack of competence in understanding how to do this. Might be able to do something with calendars, but I don't think the calendars necessarily drive you to a day by day. The calendars basically say whether you're available for that day or not. In Open Workbench, I can constrain this. So if we were to go to the resource usage, now you can see, remember when I started here, I said 50% of the time, 50% would be 4 hours. this isn't giving me 4 hours. So in fact, the duration of task 3 for Fred is in fact too short, because this should be going 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4. The only way I know how to fix this, I don't know whether I can do it here or not, let me look at the information, is I would then have to go in and see what it's done is it's defaulted to the max units. So to draw that comparison there, let's go back to, to the resource usage sheet, or excuse me, the resource sheet. That's that one right there. Is that, notice it's red all the way through, but that's red because that's set at 80%, and that's what it's using when it puts that units in. That's what I'm frustrated with, is I want it to variably do that, and it doesn't. Now, if it's 50% for the window of this thing, the quick fix is to go in here and say, I'll make this 50%. And notice what it does, it does 4, 4, 4, 4, 4. But what if in here I've got two variables? How the heck am I going to do that? It's almost like I got to create two tasks, right? I would have to create a task to cover this window and a task to cover this window. So if one of you out there knows how to do this to where I have variable units for a resource and the leveling tool can be sensitive to it, that would be fantastic. Please let me know, and I can go ahead and update this presentation to cover that. Now, to reiterate, once I start working my schedule, if I do actual work, what you're going to want to do is get either through a connection, either through, Microsoft's Project Central, I think is what it's called, or Enterprise. You can enter timesheets there, or if you have a standalone schedule, you can start entering actual work for the resource on a task here. So I can enter 1 hour, watch what happens out here. As I enter 1 hour there, look what happens, it kicks it out. And the reason why it kicks it out is it is expecting to get 2 hours here, and I didn't change the ETCs, so it kicked it out. So that is the reason why that kicked out. Notice whenever so that's what you would be doing with the schedule, is you would be modifying the actuals and hopefully getting updates to the ETC. The resource may put 1 hour in here, may say, this is only 10 hours worth of work. This thing, you would modify your ETC or your remaining work. We would have to expose that column here. And that would be remaining work is what I would suggest you would do. Remaining work. And then what you could do is put your actual in. Notice what happens when I put a 1 here. That goes down to 29, but now I could key this in and make this 10. And notice it brought the whole schedule in. Okay? So that's the work that you're going to have to do as a project manager. By the way, you've got a similar setup in Open Workbench. You're going to have to get your actuals and your ETCs in, and that's then the administrative aspect of it. So in a nutshell, that is the basic or the basics regarding effort-based scheduling. Obviously, you'd have to layer in addition to your resource availability, any constraints that you have. So you could have date constraints, you could have dependency constraints, things of that nature that would drive what you would do. But Microsoft is so comprehensive in the varying things that you can do, is you have to make sure that you do things in the correct sequence and set things up. And quite frankly, it requires a little bit more discipline than Open Workbench. Open Workbench forces you into a certain pattern. Microsoft is, the word I was looking for earlier, is extremely flexible. And so you need to make sure that you have discipline in that flexibility. But at the end of the day, if there's one thing to take away, is understand how the tool operates, and effort-based scheduling, or at least what I'm terming effort-based scheduling, demonstrates to you how the tool, when you're using the automatic capabilities, is deriving the durations. and it's a function of those calculations, of those equations that we had before. So let's go ahead and wrap up. So we talked about the pluses and minuses. I'm going to go back here. We'll go to the display settings. And again, there's those calcs again. You take a screenshot. I'm new to this, so I'll try to post some of this stuff up or get you access to this. But in the off chance that I don't, or I don't have the ability to do that, go ahead and take a screenshot of this. These are the key calculations that you want to understand. So what are the challenges? Estimates themselves are challenges. I'm sure that you're well aware. Even if you're in an agile environment, there's a lot around estimating, but you're estimating in terms of story points. And I've talked to some people that are strong agile folks that aren't using tools like this or using other tools, and they want to estimate in hours now as well. As I mentioned with MSP, you must discipline yourself to apply the hours at the assignment level, not the task level. And as I said, OWB does not allow this. And the note that I would say is that the fact that resource A can do this particular task in 40 hours does not mean resource B has the skill to do it in 40. In fact, they may have the skill to be able to do it in 20. You just don't know. One of my favorite questions for a project manager is, hey, I've got a task that's got 2 resources. I've baselined it in 20 hours at $1,500. The task is now over. It's under in hours, but it's over in dollars. How can that be? And the quick answer is there's 2 bill rates for the 2 resources. I have a senior resource on the task at $100 an hour. That's $1,000. And I've got a junior resource that's on the task at $50 an hour. That's $1,500. If the senior resource does 15 hours on the task and the junior resource does 3 hours on the task, there's my 2-hour positive variance because I've only taken 18 hours, not 20. But if I do the math, I spent $1,500 on the senior resource and $150 on the junior resource. I'm over by $150. That's the point I'm trying to drive home with this bullet point, is that it's the assignment level and the capability of the assignment. Estimates do imply precision, so you need to manage the expectations. If you feel like your estimates are soft, that's fine. Just manage that expectation and make sure that you request a change bucket or a variance or a contingency that takes that into consideration. As I alluded to when I did the demo right at the end there within Microsoft Project, you're heavy on administration. You need to capture actuals, and you need to have your team disciplined with capturing ETCs. They need to tell you how much more time they're going to need to take on that, because that's where your predictive capability is, because you're either going to reduce these ETCs, increase them, or leave them. And then depending on the cadence of your actuals is going to dictate whether your critical path increases or decreases. And then culturally, particularly with the movement to the agility, this may not be acceptable. And in fact, I've seen less and less discipline along these lines. But I am getting inquiries from companies, now that I'm retired, all of a sudden I've got a lot of people interested. I'm getting inquiries, and they're looking for some level of discipline here, or at least the way they're writing it, they're implying a high level of structure. And at least to me as the author, and this author's estimation, effort-based scheduling is in fact that high level of structure. I hope you've liked this presentation. I hope it's of value. You should be able to go out to PMI and request PDUs based on this. I had not timed this, so we got to be well into an hour here, but I would do essentially a minute for minute type presentation. You can certainly apply this as a technical to your PMI renewal, or if you're new and trying to get it, and or your scheduling if you're going for the PMI scheduling certification. Again, thank you for listening to this presentation, and I hope you found it of value.